reposted. But this was something that I really wanted to talk about. I'm a criminal defense attorney, and I've been practicing law for, man, going into the 15th year of practicing law. And when it comes to murder cases, obviously the Nipsey Hussle case was about Eric Holder having murdered Nipsey Hussle. And I have an active murder case now. We just resolved an attempted murder case recently. We have another attempted murder case right now. Represented multiple people facing life in prison. So definitely an authority on the topic. And I have, just this perspective that I bring to the table as a criminal defense attorney, but then also, just as a hip hop fan, because this hits home to the hip hop community. You know what I mean? Long before I took the oath to become a lawyer, I was a hip hop fan. I'm still a hip hop fan, and I'll be a hip hop fan until the day I die. And actually, before every law school final exam, I played 50 Cent's Hustler's Ambition. That's how hip hop I am. And it just really motivated me to get in the zone and be able to do my thing for those final exams. And so, hip hop is my passion, my love. Hip hop DJ, you know what I mean? And hip hop turns 50 this year, and you want to see your artists grow old. I don't know if you guys got a chance to see the Grammy performance, seeing legends like LL Cool J, like Run DMC, Rakim, Queen Latifah, Salt and Pepper, Public Enemy. It is wonderful to be able to see, people, receive their flowers while they're still here, right? As we celebrate hip hop, and it's almost like, when you watch basketball and you see, we just saw LeBron break Kareem's scoring record, right? And you see Kareem in the stands. And when you used to see the late Bill Russell, rest in peace to Bill Russell, but you used to see him out there. And and you wanted to see that for Kobe Bryant. And unfortunately, his life was cut short. But bringing it back to the music, when we talk about rap, you know, being a professional rapper has grown to be one of the most dangerous professions in America. And it's, it just saddens me. It breaks my heart. We saw recently P&B Rock, right? Young Dolph, XXX Tentacion, and recently Takeoff, right? Their lives were just cut short, taken away from us. And to be honest with you, like I said, I have represented, multiple people facing either attempted murder or murder charges, but but these deaths really hit home, and it just saddens me that life can be so cheap, right? That instead of looking to a man's eyes and seeing your brother, and seeing your connection to him, you see that life as expendable. And some of these deaths were over jewelry and money, and you see, how lost we've become, where it is more valuable to you to be able to take, $10,000, $50,000, some jewelry, and expire a life over jewelry. And even, with the Takeoff situation, from what I understand, there was a petty argument that had gone wrong. Guns get pulled, and shots get fired, and he ended up catching a shot that probably wasn't even meant for him. And again, it's just another example of life being so cheap. But here we're talking about Nipsey Hussle, and Nipsey Hussle was quite the inspiration. Nipsey Hussle proved that you could make something dope out of your life, even though you came from nothing, right? No matter where you come from, that you can make something out of yourself. And it just is a beautiful thing to see the rags to riches story, especially when, cats come out of the hood, when it's somebody who looks like you. And Nipsey was special. Nipsey was special. You see, if you went back to those interviews, and he was smart about his business, right? He talked about investing in real estate. He talked about, the money that you get from your rap. If you're an artist, to not go out and, blow it on jewelry. Make sure you invest it back into your business. Make sure, you're doing things that are going to grow your money, that you're gonna be able to take care of people, take care of your people around you. All of that was inspirational. And I liken it to, in another industry, obviously in politics, but it's the same way that President Obama, was to me, if you will. Right? There's a lot to be said for someone who looks like you to make it into the most powerful position in the land. Right? And I just really would be curious to see, because I'm sure, there's going to be some sort of polls, or some sort of study on the effect on young black youth who got to grow up and see President Obama as their president. I'm just really curious to see how, that shapes one's mind, because, to be honest with you, I never had anybody, when I was coming up, there were no, inspirational lawyers. There were no stories out there to help me see that I could be whatever I wanted to be. It was just, it was theory, right? Your parents tell you, hey, you work hard, you go to school, you do the right thing, you can make something out of yourself. But, I didn't really have that image. And but Nipsey will have been an inspiration to the young black youth in a different way, right? Because I think that, when you look at a President Obama, Harvard educated, right? What was it, the president of law review? That's not quite as relatable as Nipsey Hussle was, right? You could see yourself in Nipsey Hussle. His image was a lot more obtainable than Obama was, right? And I look at the Hoves, your Jay-Z's, your Puffs, as business inspiration. When I was in college, that was an inspiration for me to be able to run my own business, that I could forge my own path, right? You had Jay-Z starting Rockefeller, you had Puff Daddy starting Bad Boy Records. They had their own businesses. They dreamed up their own, plan. This is how we're going to do this, and then we're going to go after it. We're going to go all in, and basically chart out our own destiny. And that is inspirational. I just, remember listening to those records. I remember being in college listening to Jay-Z's You Don't Know, right? Everyone trying to tell you what you can't do. Oh, you're a rapper. What are you trying to do? Start a clothing line. Then you come up with Rockefeller, right? Or you come up with Rockaware, right? You look at Puff. Everybody had the Sean John velour suits, right? What you're just a rapper. You're just a producer. What are you doing? Trying to, start a clothing line. And these are, just inspirational stories. And then, you had other rappers who started their clothing line. I don't know if anybody rocks Snoop Dogg clothing, right? He had his clothing line. Nelly had Dirty, right? Yeah, Ti had a coup. I don't know if he still has that, but he had his clothing line. But there's always been this meshing between hip hop and fashion. They've always been intertwined. Hip hop, fashion, and sports, right? And as you think about those clothing lines, those were the foundation for then, Nipsey Hussle to come up with the marathon clothing, right? And he had the marathon clothing store, and I never made it there. A lot of my friends got some fly, sweaters and shirts. He put Crenshaw on the map, made that almost a mainstream thing. Imagine that, seeing shirts across the nation saying Crenshaw, you know. He literally bought back the block. Man, that's a tongue twister. My man bought back the block. He had the marathon store, creating jobs, creating opportunities, right? He lived up to the name Neighborhood Nip. On any given day, you could see Nipsey Hussle, standing outside the marathon store, no security, right? How many times do we see rappers, they're moving around like they got Secret Service with them? And that's no disrespect. I mean, you can now see the necessity, you can see the need for having that level of security, right? Because we're seeing now that these guys' lives are potentially at risk every time they step outside the house. But yet Nipsey Hussle felt comfortable in his hood, felt comfortable around his people. In fact, the day he died, he was out there taking pictures and signing autographs. So he definitely lived up to the neighborhood Nip name. He invested nearly $2.5 million, into that lot where he was killed with those businesses that he had. And um, you know, it just really is a tragedy. Thank you so much, Destiny Reloaded. I appreciate it. Trying to deliver. We're doing live. I'm gonna be doing more live streaming this year, and I'm gonna tell you, this content creation thing is very much new to your boy. Listen, I've been like I said, I'm going into my 15th year of practicing law. To God be the glory. I'm very grateful to have had such a long career at this point and a successful career, but I'm very new to this content creation thing is new. We've got on YouTube, we're at around 12,000 subscribers, so I'm definitely appreciative. I hope everybody who's watching is subscribed. If you're not already, please go to my channel, make sure you subscribed on the YouTube. But yeah, we're just going to keep getting better and better and better. It's all about that progression. You're not supposed to just start out from zero and be at level 100. You got to go through your steps. You got to take your steps and then you'll get there. So yeah, we're going to be talking about this Eric Holder sentencing, talking about Nipsey Hussle. I'll get into some Q&A a little later. We can talk about, I'll answer questions about this case. And then, if people have questions about other cases and other legal matters, I'm happy to answer those as well. But, let's talk about why this case actually went to trial, because a lot of people were confused as to why this case would go to trial, right? Because, you had clear surveillance video that Eric Holder had shot and killed Nipsey Hussle. And when you have, a smoking gun in the form of a surveillance video, no pun intended, but when you have that level of evidence, a lot of people were like, man, this is a slam dunk, open and shut case for the prosecution. There's no reason why we need to, waste the court's time, waste a jury's time. Man, lock this dude up. Auntie, hey, I love you. Lock this dude up and throw away the key. But, this is where it was very important for me to let folks know that no, even if the evidence looks like you might be guilty, you have a right. You have a right to hold the government to its burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that you are guilty of the crime that you're being charged with. Beyond that, the other issue is that, typically in a criminal case, when a criminal case starts, after you enter your not guilty plea, they're going to provide you the evidence, right? So you're going to get the police reports, witness statements, photographs, videos, forensic evidence, whatever the DA has that they think points to your guilt, right? And so, they're going to give that over to the defense attorney. And then ideally, the defense attorney is going to go over it with the client, right? You're going to review the evidence with your client. And your client's going to be able to look there at the evidence and be able to say, hey, nah, this didn't happen. This is a lie. This is an exaggeration. Nah, this didn't go down like this. Actually, this is what happened. Can you have your investigator go and interview this person because they saw it go down? I need you to take pictures of this. I need you to take video of this and build up your defense, right? Well, at some point, the defense and the prosecution are going to have a discussion to see, hey, can we settle this case, right? Because it's a very small percentage of cases that actually go to trial. I know that all day, every day, if you look on social media, you look at the news, you see criminal trials always going on, but it is a very rare occurrence that a case is going to go to trial. I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of, maybe 3-4% of cases that actually go to trial. So that means that 90+% cases end up getting resolved via some sort of plea deal. Well, the issue is, in this type of case, the prosecutor was never going to really make an offer to Eric Holder, right? Because not only had he shot and killed Nipsey Hussle, but there were two other victims that gotten hit that day. And so in these type of cases, the DA is not going to make you an offer. So, in a normal, say a violent crime or even a burglary or a robbery, at some point the DA is going to make an offer, right? And that offer is going to be for, less charges. So if you got, charged with say 5 or 7 counts, they might offer you to plead guilty to 2 counts. We're going to dismiss the rest of the counts, and you're going to be, facing less time than if you were to go to trial and get found guilty, right? So it's your incentive to take advantage of the plea offer. But in a case like this, oftentimes the DA will not make any offer. There will be no offer on the table, right? So, if you're facing 25 to life or, even more time to life, then, you would then have to come to the table with an offer, right? So it would be on the defense to come to the table to the DA with an offer. And don't, make no mistakes about it. It's not going to be 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, or even 30-year offer. In order for the DA to have accepted an offer from the defense on these facts, in this case, they probably would have had to come to the table with at least, 35, 40 years. Anything less than that, the DA just, really probably wouldn't even consider an offer. And the stronger the prosecutor believes their case to be, the less incentive they have to negotiate and provide something that would, that someone might deem to be fair to them. What's up, Mr. Prolific? Thank you for pulling up. I appreciate you. And so, so that's why this case had to go to trial. There really wasn't going to be an opportunity for this case to settle, right? And so, one of the questions that comes up a lot of times when you see somebody who is, let's say, an unpopular defendant, right? And Eric Holder was as unpopular as they come, right? You kill someone who was such a huge inspiration, to the hip hop community, to the Black community in general, to, the nation, because, it's not just us who love hip hop. Hip hop is a global entity at this point, right? And Nipsey was so beloved that, anybody who was going to defend Eric Holder, was gonna, be even more a villain than we already feel as defense attorneys, right? Because make no mistakes about it, when we're in the courtroom, oftentimes, it's me and my client, right? It's the defense attorney and the client, and you're the villains in the room, right? And so, if you ask me, would I have taken on that case? No, I would not. I would not have represented Eric Holder. All right. So I have no problem whatsoever in defending murder cases. Like I said, I have defended murder cases. I have an active murder case as it stands. I have an active attempted murder case, but I wouldn't defend Eric Holder. I am in the position as a private defense attorney. I'm able to pick and choose the cases that, that I want to take on and work with the people that I want to work with. And for me, if you were the man who killed Nipsey Hussle, I'll leave that to the next guy. And that would just be my personal choice. Not that I, and the other part of it is, people will oftentimes ask, well, how can you represent somebody is guilty? That's a brilliant question. It's a very good question. And one I too had, when I was in law school. I didn't understand why, how could you represent somebody when they did it? But then you come to understand how the system works and understand that everybody has the right to a defense. Everybody has the Sixth Amendment right to counsel. And there's not an exception to that rule based on how ugly the facts are of your case, or how, extremely vile the nature of what you did is. No, there is no exception. Everybody has a right to a defense. And I wholeheartedly believe that. And us, more than anything, we have to make sure that we stand behind that. However, with that being said, defending Eric Holder, that would not be in the cards for me. And I don't know if you guys had paid attention, but Christopher Darden, who was the prosecutor in the O.J. Simpson case, right? He was on the prosecution team. He, had since become a defense attorney, and he was on this case early on. And unfortunately, he ended up getting death threats. And so he ended up excusing himself from that case. And so, I found that it was interesting that he was on the case, and not pocket watching or anything like that. But, I can't imagine that there was, a lot of money there in that situation for him to get paid. But since it was going to be such a high profile case, perhaps he, kind of felt like, I'll get paid in clout, I'll get paid in exposure, and decided to take the matter on. I don't know. But once he got them death threats, he's like, I'm out. And I'll tell you right now, I've never been on a case and received death threats, but that would be a problem for me. At the end of the day, I got to get home to my family, and there is no bag, there is no case, there is no career accolade that is worth putting my life at risk. And so that's just not something I'm willing to do. But anyway, Eric Holder ended up being represented by the public defender, and his lawyer did everything that he could. Sometimes, I mean, we don't have magic wands. We're given the facts. Everything is done long before we come onto the scene, right? And you get what you get, and you got to work with what you got. Right. And thank you so much. Please like and share. Yeah, if you haven't liked, please show me some love and hit that like button. I appreciate you, Queen Brielle. Thank you so much. And so, so we have Eric Holder represented by the public defender, and he gets charged with murder. And basically that means that he had intentionally killed Nipsey Hussle, right? And so very early on in this trial, they showed their hand in terms of the defense that they were going to go with, and that was a heat of passion manslaughter defense, right? So their whole thing was basically, hey, we're not denying that Eric Holder killed Nipsey Hussle, right? And I was surprised that that they had kind of showed their hand that early on in the trial, but that they did, right? And so they basically conceded, yes, Eric Holder killed Nipsey Hussle, but it was in the heat of passion, right? So they were looking to justify the killing, right? Because if you can get voluntary manslaughter, then you're looking at way less time. You're looking at way less time than 25, 35, 60 to life, right? And so basically what they try to do is use this talk, so right before the murder took place, there was this conversation that had taken place between, Nipsey Hussle and Eric Holder, and Nipsey Hussle had said, something to the effect of, word on the street is, you might have been talking about some stuff, right? So you might have been snitching. And we all know that, there's some heavy implications behind that, right? So we can't make light of how serious it is to accuse somebody of that, and they come from an era that's different from, I think, some of these rappers that are caught up in this situation, but you can see the implications of what it means. Like, look at the Gunna situation, right? You see Gunna, he had that plea hearing where he had to admit YSL is a gang and YSL does gang stuff and the like. And as a result of that, like, no rappers want to work with Gunna anymore, right? So his name is just done, right? I imagine there's some, cats who might still want to get on a track with him, but there was someone who I think they paid him $250,000 to get on a track with them, and then that happened. They're like, nah, can I get my money back? Like, your name's not getting the streets anymore, right? And that's the modern day. We're seeing what that means to people. But going back to Nipsey Hussle and Eric Holder, they were from the same hood, they were from the same set. And when Nipsey brings this to his attention, again, from Eric Holder's perspective, you can't just be playing around with somebody's name like that. And I'm not saying that Nipsey Hussle was playing around with his name, but I'm just saying in general, you can't just say that. There are repercussions to that, and those can oftentimes be deadly, right? And so, what his attorney was trying to argue was that, basically Eric Holder was so provoked by Nipsey Hussle suggesting that he was a snitch that just sent him into a rage. And that sent him into such a rage that his judgment was clouded. And so that's what led to him, pulling out the gun and ultimately killing Nipsey Hussle. And ultimately, if that theory were bought by the jury, then, that changes the case from a murder case to a manslaughter case, which means that he's facing far less time. I think the max term on a voluntary manslaughter is like 11 years, something like that, And so, we're talking about a completely different situation. And so realistically, as an attorney, as a defense attorney, I knew, and probably you guys knew too. Let me know, did you guys buy that defense? Did you think that defense had any chance at working out? Let me know in the comments if you thought that defense had any chance at being successful. I did not, and here's why. Number one, I don't think that was going to be considered sufficient provocation. I do believe that could provoke someone to get angry. However, in terms of, what the law says, it's not just about a person being provoked and, being, acting rashly given the provocation. There's a reasonable person standard in there. What you have to also prove is that the provocation would cause the average person, just the average person of average disposition, to also act in this same way. And the reality is, the average person, is not going to be provoked by being called a snitch. And that's why, this really had no chance. Not only that, but the other thing is what's called the cooling off period. So let's just say, even if the jury somehow believed that, he was just in this fit of rage and couldn't think clearly, there's what's called a cooling off period. So if too much time passes between the act of provocation and then the killing, then they're going to say, well, nah, the cooling off period applies. You had too much time to cool down. You weren't really as enraged as you're saying that you were, right? And the classic example of using this heat of passion murder is the, the guy that comes home, he comes home from work, right? Comes home from work early, goes to get the flowers, goes to get the chocolate. He comes home, walks through the door, hears some noise, what's going on? Goes on upstairs and hears, his wife in bed with another man, right? If he acted in that moment, right, the law has accepted that in that situation, a person can be so incensed, enraged, seeing red, that if he then killed, his wife and or the guy in that situation, then that would be voluntary manslaughter. That's the heat of passion defense. But even on those facts, let's just say, that happened. The guy comes home early, catches his wife in bed with another man. Good evening, Peter. Thank you so much for pulling up. If he catches his wife in bed with another man and says, oh, hell no. And he goes right back down the stairs, right? He goes down the stairs, goes outside, goes out to the shed, grabs the shotgun, loads up the shotgun, closes up the shed, comes right back in the house, goes up the stairs, goes into the bedroom, and then blows both of their heads off. Now they're going to say, no. In the moment, that would have been, the heat of passion. But, you had too much time to cool off. You had too much time to think, and so this was kind of the same situation. Again, I don't think that this was going to be sufficient provocation in order to warrant a voluntary manslaughter charge. But at the same time, even if it were, I think there was just too much time. He had time to, to eat and circle the block and minutes. So minutes had passed. I think it was like 9 minutes between when that conversation took place and when he actually shot Nipsey Hussle. And that's just way too long. All right. And so the DA's position was basically that, Eric Holder was just jealous of Nipsey Hussle. Thank you so much, Chauncey TV. I appreciate you. They just believe that he was this was jealousy, right? And to me, and I'll never know, we'll never know, perhaps, right? We heard a lot of conspiracy theories out there, and I'll be honest with you. I don't know anything about any conspiracy theories. If there was, someone behind Eric Holder who put him up to it or gave him a bag to off Nipsey Hussle. I don't know anything about that. I'm not an investigative journalist. All I can work with is what's in the court record. And so there was nothing to suggest that any other, type of foul play was going on. So I don't know anything about that. But, based on what we have, it does look like, there was an element of jealousy. And again, think about it. Eric Holder and Nipsey, they were from the same hood. They were from the same set, right? And Nipsey became famous. He was a legend. He was rich. And Eric Holder probably, considered himself to be a nobody. I mean, like, what did he have to show for, anything in his life? And, they both rapped, right? So we came to find out that Nipsey Hussle, obviously we knew Nipsey Hussle rap, but, we came to find out that Eric Holder rapped. And again, Nipsey Hussle was known around the globe, while Eric Holder, wasn't even a household name, at least, not outside of Compton, I don't think, right? And so, it was mentioned that, Eric Holder, during this conversation, that he had mentioned, hey, I got some music I was working on, right? Have you guys heard it? And they were like, nah, we haven't heard it, right? And you can think about how that conversation might have went down. It could have been as cut and dry as not, like we just haven't heard it, all the way to, I mean, how we can clown, right, man? Like, ain't nobody checking for your music, man, right? So and and the words can sting, right? Cats get the basing on you, and it can sting. It can hurt your pride, right? And let me tell you, having done this for a long time, going into my 15th year, there are so many people in jail and prison over foolish pride, right? Someone said something that you took as disrespect. Something that someone said or something that someone did pissed you off, and now you got to get your get back, right? And so now you beat the brakes off of somebody, you shoot somebody, you kill somebody because you felt disrespected, right? And that's just a dangerous thing. We can't take so seriously the words of other people, especially people we don't even like, or we don't even respect. And again, I don't know that that's the situation, and I would argue that Nipsey Hussle was a person worth respecting, right? But on some level, it appears that he felt disrespected, and that's why he acted out the way he did. There was another element that Eric Holder may have been under the influence of a drug at the time. All right. So there was talks about, thank you, Uncle. Man, I got my family supporting me. My Auntie Barbara, my Uncle Albert Wright. Thank you so much for pulling up. I appreciate it. But yes, there were reports that he may have been under the influence of drugs. And people do a lot of things that they regret after the fact, being under the influence of alcohol, being under the influence of drugs, the combination of the two. And then all it takes, and especially on top of that, if somebody just has built up pent up rage, all it takes is, to be under the influence of drugs and alcohol, and someone to say or do the wrong thing, and you get set off. And then you do something that after the fact, if you hadn't been under the influence of alcohol or drugs, you'd never do that, right? Because you would have the presence of mind to stop yourself from doing something that's going to ruin your life, that's going to ruin someone else's life, that might take a life. There's no coming back from that. And then when you mix that with mental health issues, and we'll learn a little later on that Eric Holder did have documented mental health issues. And this is something that oftentimes just goes undiagnosed. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in a jail cell with a client, and I just knew, you could just tell, And maybe I can just tell as a professional, but I'd like to think that if you're just the least bit perceptive, you can tell that something is off. And I mean that with all due respect, because I don't put any negative stigma on, on mental health issues, because that person doesn't have any control over that. That's, they didn't have anything to do with how they became bipolar, how they suffer from depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, PTSD. And unfortunately, you know, in our communities, a lot of times there's just a lack of resources, there's a lack of insight, there's a lack of understanding of what these things are. We all have that person in the family that they say, oh, well, he's just kind of off, right? Or, he's always been crazy, right? Because again, there hasn't been that access to there hasn't been that access to mental health resources and the like. OG Flash, I appreciate the comment. Listen, I just said not too long ago, I don't know if there was a setup. There's a lot of conspiracy theories out there. If that information's out there, I'm more than happy to look at it, but I don't know that to be the case, and obviously that wasn't presented at the trial. Um, so going back to these mental health issues, these are things that require professional intervention and treatment, and oftentimes medication. But if we don't acknowledge these things as being necessary, then it comes back to bite us years later. When you have a situation like this, right? When you have someone self-medicating because they can't quiet the voices in their head, or they can't, they just can't seem to feel right. Something feels off. You just can't understand why you're so, sad all the time, why you're so angry all the time, voices in your head, whatever the mental health issue is. And oftentimes, yes, people will resort to self-medication, whether that's, abusing alcohol, abusing pills. That's something that just has become very prominent, in the last years. People taking, Vicodin, Xanax, Oxycontin, all kinds of prescription pills to escape the pain. And when you mix those, drugs and alcohol, like I said, it becomes a recipe for disaster in a situation like this. And so again, it's a tragedy all around. Um, you know, it's just sad to know that another one of our brilliant artists, someone as special as Nipsey Hussle, got his life taken away in such a savage manner. And so, again, what we were talking about is sentencing. That's what the whole purpose of this live stream was. And before sentencing, the defense is going to file what's called a statement in mitigation, right? Because as defense attorneys, we're trying to get the least amount of time for our clients, right? We're trying to make sure their rights are protected and make sure they're getting treated fairly within the system. And part of that is making sure that they're not doing any more time than they should have to, right? And oftentimes we're able to present information that no one else would otherwise have access to, right? If our client has mental health issues, or if our client did suffer from a really rough childhood, there was a lot of abuse in the childhood, there was a lot of alcoholism in the childhood, undiagnosed mental health disorders, or whatever the situation is, such that a person may not necessarily be able to appreciate their actions in a way that a healthy minded person would, or just how they ended up in the situation that they ended up in the first place, right? So you're going to be presenting all that information to the judge in hopes that they can, exercise some leniency as against your client. And the DA, on the other hand, is going to be filing a statement in aggravation, where, they might be asking for more time, right? And so then the judge is going to hear both sides. He's going to have seen, both sides paperwork. So you're going to file motions, and on the defense side, oftentimes we'll file psychological evaluations, a bunch of letters of support, all kinds of people who show that, they love the individual, right? Parents saying, hey, I understand that you have to sentence my son, but understand that, we love him. He's loved, and, he's always been a good kid, and, all these different type of things to add life to the situation, because otherwise the only thing that the judge will have to go by is the evidence that came out at trial. And oftentimes that's not really going to do, the defendant any favors. And so one of the other parts of the actual sentencing hearing is going to be impact statements. And I can tell you that, it is very, very, very emotional in a criminal courtroom when you're listening to victim, impact statements, right? I was saying earlier, before we even got started with this trial, the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial was just finishing off, and that was a huge trial, right? There was all kinds of media coverage in that trial, a lot of talk about that trial and everything. But what I said was that that trial is going to be very different from what we're going to see in this trial. And if you step into a criminal courtroom, you can cut through the tension like a knife. And especially that sense is even more heightened when you're talking about a homicide case, because there's just that sense that you're talking about a situation where a person lost their life and they're never coming back, and the person who allegedly killed that person is sitting in the courtroom, facing trial, facing charges for having taken someone's life. And you can just feel that. You can feel the tension in the courtroom. And one of those impact statements came from Cowboy Douglas, a close friend of Nipsey Hussle. He was standing with Nipsey when Nipsey was killed. He testified at trial, and he told the judge that, this was a big loss for me personally, and all of the community in LA, where Nipsey Hussle was a business leader, where he was an inspiration. He even said, hey, Nipsey Hussle was like a son to me, and he was like a dad to me, right? So I believe Cowboy is older than Nipsey, so he saw him as a son, but he also looked up to Nipsey Hussle like a dad. He said, listen, man, our community is hurting. We lost everything. We lost everything that we worked for, over this one mistake by this one guy. This guy decided he was going to take Nipsey's life, and now we're all suffering for it, right? Again, Nipsey created jobs. Nipsey created opportunities for folks. There were a lot of people who had said that, Nipsey Hussle was sending out care packages to folks. If you just got out of prison, he'd get you set up, get you some clothes, right? Some nice t-shirts, sweatpants, things that you needed. Because when you get out and you haven't been working for 5 years, 10 years, you might not have anybody to hold you down like that. And that's just really special, and speaks to, how wonderful of a person Nipsey Hussle was. And so, you know, basically he had said, listen, I don't care how much time you give this guy, because it's not about the time. He just wanted to know why. And that's the question that so many of us are left with, like, why did this have to happen? Right. And that's just a question that we are still left trying to answer, and will probably forever go unanswered, the why. And the defense attorney basically was asking for the lesser sentence. So the defense got a chance to present, and they're saying, hey, we're looking for 25 to life, right? So, you got to understand that when the defense is asking for less time, right, they've got to be reasonable, and there's a range within which they can ask for the time. So it's not like he could, ask the judge for probation or ask the judge for a couple of years. He had to stick within, what Nipsey had been convicted of. And he asked for 25 to life. And ultimately the purpose behind that was that so he could, at least have a chance at, release. Definitely he would be very well, up in age, but at least he'd have an opportunity to see the light of day outside of a prison cell at some point. And part of what he cited, again, as we talk about these situations, he mentioned that Eric Holder, was subjected to physical abuse as a child, right? So he was, he grew up in an impoverished neighborhood, in an impoverished household. It was and after, when he became an adult, then that's when he, suffered into, or fell into, he described it as a terrible descent into mental illness, right? And we can look at that cynically, but if we remove our the way we feel about Nipsey Hussle's life being taken and just look at, what Eric Holder had to have been going through, he said this led to years of torment and struggle with issues including agonizing auditory hallucinations. So, he was hearing voices, right? Hearing voices, and he had been, his father had submitted a letter, basically saying, "Hey, my son has been, experiencing auditory schizophrenia since 19 years old." Right. And I believe Eric Holder was in his 30s by the time the trial came around. Right. So he was hearing voices, and actually just a few weeks before the killing took place, he ended up throwing a weight through a window because he was having a manic episode and he feared that he was going to get killed. Right. So Eric Holder definitely had some issues going on. And I think one of the saddest parts, aside from Nipsey Hussle losing his life, was Eric Holder ultimately, his father saying, "Hey, listen, I know that there are not enough words that will fill the void, right? The pain, the deep sorrow that they feel." And what he said was, "I question myself every day, asking if I, as a father, did everything I could to help my son stabilize his mental health." And that's something that he's got to live with for the rest of his life. Wondering, hey, if I had, I'm sorry, did I say Nipsey was convicted? My bad. And he had to wonder, and he'll always have to wonder, if he had taken his son to get the proper treatment for this schizophrenia, we might not be, I might not be on this live today talking about, Nipsey Hussle being murdered. We might be talking about the R. Kelly case. We might be talking about, we might be talking about the Michael Irvin situation or something else. But the sad part is, again, and maybe this is the PSA, if you have somebody in your life who might be suffering from, some sort of mental illness, mental disorder, then, it could be the cry to get the help that they need. And I think it's really important. I just had a conversation with a client the other day, and, it was a few hours in to this conversation that, that I suggested maybe you should get, maybe you should get some help, right? And you really gotta ease into that conversation, because a lot of times, as men, as Black men, there is a stigma, right, with mental health. There's an aversion, right? I don't I don't need to talk to nobody about my problems, right? I'll take care of myself. I don't need some doctor trying to tell me I'm crazy. I don't know, not wanting to, address those issues. But a lot of times, that's exactly what needs to be done, right? So we can, quote unquote, live our best lives. But ultimately, the judge was not convinced by the defense's statement and mitigation or the arguments, and ultimately sentenced Eric Holder to 60 years of life. Right. And that was based on the 25 to life. And then there was another 25 added for use of the handgun. And then there were 10 more years for the assaults on Kerry Lathan and Shermy Villanueva. So that's how we get to 60 years to life. And, so that essentially means that he will spend the rest of his life in prison, obviously. And, just a tragic story, and sad all around. So, just kind of wanted to talk about that. Want to see if anyone has any questions that I might be able to answer. We get a lot of questions in the comment section on some of these videos about people, having questions about the video itself, the topic itself, but then sometimes people have questions about other legal issues. So it's, it's about 7:51 here on the West Coast. And so if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer some of those. Otherwise, we might be ready to wrap up pretty soon. So yeah, let me know in the comment section. Take advantage. Part of this whole thing about doing these lives is I definitely want to be a community resource. A lot of times, I'm in private practice, right? And so, people can't always afford legal representation. And, I think there's some rules. I probably can't, technically provide legal advice, right? But I can, answer questions, right? I can comment, right? I think I can comment on things. So if you have questions, leave me a comment below. Kick it for a little while, answer some questions. Otherwise, we're winding down here. No opportunity for parole. Is that correct? Well, is 60 to life. So, and that's a good question. Chauncey TV. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. um, that's part of the reason why his defense attorney was asking for a 25 to life. Excuse me. Let me get some water. Part of the reason why he was asking for 25 to life was so that there would be a chance for parole, because you end up having to do, whatever the number is. So if you have a second degree murder and it's 15 to life, you got to do the 15, and then you'd be up for your parole board hearings, right? And so generally speaking, on a homicide case, I mean, they're going to deny you the first time around, at least, probably the first two times around. But then, third time might be a charm. But, when you're talking about 60, you're talking about 60 to life, where you got to do 60 first. I mean, come on now. So yeah, that pretty much seals Eric Holder's fate. I don't think he's gonna, be able to make it out of prison. Thank you, Peter. I will be doing more lives for sure. Again, each one will get better and better. I'm a rookie in the game. It's definitely humbling to, be well, solidified in your day job, in your career, and then, get knocked back down to square one in terms of starting something new. So it's fun, it's challenging. And more than anything, I'd like to think it's helpful and useful to the community to be able to hear, straight from the horse's mouth, in terms of somebody who does this for a living and does this on a day to day. So doesn't look like we have any more questions. I'll leave, maybe a few more seconds. If we have another question, I'll be happy to answer. Again, it could be on the topic of this case, or, on anything legally related. Yeah. Yeah, definitely got to dive into the R. Kelly case. He was just sentenced today. Thank you, Uncle Albert. I really appreciate you tuning in. Thanks so much. Yeah, so he was just sentenced today. Looks like he was sentenced to 20 years. The judge ran the 19 of those years concurrent, and then there's 1 year hanging over that, he'll have to do consecutive to the 30 years on the New York case. So thank you, Chauncey. I appreciate you pulling up. Thank you for coming through. Yeah, so that's an interesting thing. I think, well, actually, the prosecutors in that case, they wanted, it's my understanding, they wanted the sentence on the Chicago case to run consecutive. So meaning he'd have to do the 30-year sentence in New York, and then they would tack on that 20. But the judge said, nah, we're not going to do that. We're going to run them concurrent. So we'll probably get to that one coming up soon. But yeah, I think this is going to do it for now. I really want to appreciate every single one of you for sitting down with me. I know that there's a lot. Don't get me started on Kales. I know you burned me in the comment section, Peter. But yeah, I know that you could be doing anything else. There's a lot of distractions out there. There's a lot of things you could be doing, but you spent some time with me, and I'm very grateful for that. Thanks so much. We'll get it going pretty soon. Probably in the next week or two, we'll get another live stream going. So, next time, if you can share it, like it, Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel, and we'll see you next time. All right. Peace out.